All right, guys, we're going to get started here. Any questions with respect to, I guess, the quiz last week or anything else that still isn't clear up to this point? No? So as always, if ever you did something wrong on the quiz and you think it was right, well, feel free to email me. Sometimes there might be some adjustments that has to be done. Otherwise, we're going to move on. So for this week, you guys were expected to cover Chapter 3, which deals with supply, demand, and market equilibrium. Does anyone have any questions with regards to any of those topics? No? Okay, so one of the big themes I want to kind of talk with you guys about today is the whole application of these changes in market equilibrium, but in an actual real-life setting. So we'll get to this in a second here, and I'll just kind of introduce it so you guys could start thinking about it as the class goes, and hopefully we could get some good discussions afterwards. But regardless of what you end up doing after being here at Bishop's, whatever career you decide to choose, knowing some of this information may be really relevant to you. Why could it be relevant? Well, if you study in finance or you've invested money in any kind of business, you're interested in knowing as soon as something such as a pandemic hits, what companies will do really well afterwards, which ones won't do so well. How are prices going to change? How are quantities going to change? What industry are you more likely going to be laid off? Which industry is likely to strive and to do well? You want to be able to know that to properly invest your money. So if you study and you work in finance, well, obviously that's your career and you're hoping to make as much profit as possible for your investors. But even if you're a non-investor, you're interested in knowing this for your own investments, even if you're not someone in finance. And then also, you might be interested in all of these movements that may happen to just understand how things will evolve, how prices will change. And I'll give you guys some examples of that with myself this summer with construction work and what's happened in this whole pandemic, how prices have shifted. So take a bit of time if you want during class. You could kind of try to find some ideas here of different kind of industries that have changed a lot in this last pandemic and how we could have foreseen that as best as possible. Now we're kind of at that phase that we're seeing things happen after the fact. So the after the fact situation is what happens on equilibrium price and quantity. But what we want to get to is before the fact. So in this class, some questions that you might have on a quiz or a final exam deals with news events. And in these news events, you're going to be asked to do kind of three things. Okay? And I've highlighted that before, and I'll highlight it again. So I'm kind of going from the end, moving back forward towards the beginning, and then I'll focus on the beginning, and I'll go all the way back to the end. But the thing that you want to make sure to highlight when you think of any news event is, first off, you want to determine whether this will shift supply or demand and why. And the second thing you have to determine is whether the shift is going to be left or right. So increase or decrease, or left or right is the same kind of thing. So left or right. Or you could also see this, if you prefer, as an increase or decrease. And then afterwards, once you've established which curve shifts and in what direction, you should be able to determine what is expected to happen to price and quantity. Equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So the examples you could think of now of things that you've noticed that have changed, prices of things that you noticed that have changed, certain things that you may have noticed over the summer that were harder to purchase, weren't available as much as usual. You've seen the impacts. So you've seen this end point. You've seen what happens at the end. Okay? And hopefully if we go through some examples of seeing what happened in the end, we could try to figure out what led to this situation. But we should also be able to forecast. Because if you're someone who has money aside or you're someone studying in finance, you don't want to know that your stock, the company that you invested in, lost 20% after the fact, and that you missed out on an opportunity with another company that gained 50% during the same time frame. You want to be able to see this coming. So that's the whole goal of being able to analyze these news events as best as possible. So we'll go through this in a second. And moving back to the very essence of this, we're just going to talk about supply and demand very briefly. You've done the videos, you've probably seen this maybe in college or somewhere else, high school, beforehand. But we're just going to dive into this whole analogy of the demand curve just to kind of understand where it comes from. So for the purpose of this, I want you guys just to imagine that you're going to another country. Hopefully one day we'll be able to go to other countries again. You're going to another country and you go out and you go and have either a coffee, a drink, some piece of food, whatever. You go out and you notice that, let's say, a beer cost 50 cents. And you're wondering, well, how many units will you purchase? Well, just knowing that the beer is 50 cents, is that enough for you to establish your decision? Or is there other pieces of information that you might be looking into to determine how much beer you want to buy? What are the different things that you might be interested in? Yeah.
Alcohol percentage.
Okay, yeah. So if you think about that, buying beer, you could think about like the alcohol percentage. So that's an external factor other than the price. So there's the beer price, alcohol percentage. What else? Yeah.
Do you like the kind of beer they're buying?
Okay, so do you like it? So does it taste good? So you might not buy like 20 units if you don't know if it tastes good. Yeah.
Like what time of day it is or day of the week? Like,
Yeah, for sure. What time it is? Okay. Anything else? Well, would it make a difference if beer is 50 cents and coffee is like $10 and wine is $20? Or if wine and coffee is only 5 cents each, would it make a difference on your consumption of beer at 50 cents? Yeah. So you want to know like the price of competing products and so on. There's other factors there that you want to know, but there's a series of things that you need to know to base your decision. Okay. Anytime you see a new product being released or you're going to shop around for something, you want to know a series of information. You want to know what else is available. You want to know, like, is it really a good product? Is it reliable? If you're shopping for a new car, or like I just bought last week a new hot water tank, like any random purchase that you might be interested, you're trying to compare a bunch of things to try to establish, is this a good price and is this really a purchase I want to make? Okay. So there's a lot of factors out there. But when we draw a demand curve, all we're doing is we are representing our preferences in this price to quantity framework. So here we would have the price of the beer in that country, and you'd have the quantity of beer that you purchase. So you could have a situation that you say that you would buy a certain amount of units, but when you make these decisions, when you draw this link between these two variables, you know all the other pieces of information. Or you treat these pieces of information as what you would expect. Maybe you haven't seen the price of the wine. Maybe you haven't tasted it to see how it tastes. But you're starting from a certain situation that you say, well, this would be my consumption based on different prices because I assume that the price of other things are this. I assume that it's this time of the week. I know what time of the week it is, or else something's going bad. And I assume that it's going to taste good and it's going to have like a favorable percentage and I won't get sick from it and blah, 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 you know? So there's a series of things that you kind of assume or you take as given. So all of these other external factors that we assume, we kind of take it as given. There's different ways of referring to it. We could say we assume it, or in very technical economics terms, we say ceteris paribus, which says this is a relationship between price and quantity holding everything else constant. Okay? I assume something and those things aren't changing. As I'm establishing my link between the price and the quantity of a certain good, I assume that nothing else changes. But if I were to ask you, like in the next month or so, Apple's going to release their new iPhone. Tomorrow, Tesla has a big announcement with Battery Day. I'm looking forward to seeing what they're going to announce, this new technology. And maybe they're going to release a new product. Who knows? But as soon as one of those things comes out, you might tell yourself, well, at this price, I would buy a new iPhone. At this price, I wouldn't. You could establish that link. But if within the week or so before you actually go and buy it, Sony or another brand releases a product that to you is superior at a cheaper price, it's going to influence your decision. So this relationship between price and quantity was assuming nothing else changes. But as soon as a competitor comes in with a new product that you prefer at a better price point, all of a sudden your demand curve, this relationship, may move. Okay? So the big thing that you have to note from any demand curve, I could draw one here now, any demand curve as here, is it assumes all external factors are constant. The only thing it doesn't assume to be constant is the price. Because in this graph, it looks at the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So it allows its own price to vary, and this is what creates this curve. At a very high price, I will not purchase a lot. If the price goes down, I will purchase more, and if the price goes down even further, I will purchase even more. That is the law of demand. As the price goes down of a good, the more you purchase. We'll see with elasticity that this may be very vertical or very flat, depending on the type of product that we're dealing with. But this is the relationship that we expect. But it assumes that all these other things do not change. And when we have a news event, such as things that we'll analyze with COVID and all of these steps, what's changing in these news events are something other than the price. And if the price changes, it's the result of something else. So maybe in the case of iPhones, the equilibrium price was, let's say, $1,000. And then all of a sudden, Sony releases a phone that's way better than the iPhone in picture quality, speed, everything. And they've charged less for it. And all of a sudden, Apple, who was expecting to sell a lot and created a certain level of supply, all of a sudden they realize that due to a drop in taste because of a price of a related goods been lower, there's been a drop in demand happening of this product. And as this drop in demand happens, well, what happens initially? Because this impact on price and quantity happens over time. If Apple releases a new iPhone for $1,000 and Sony releases one afterwards, you can't just say that the price of Apple iPhone will suddenly change automatically. That's not how it happens. If you think about the stock market, as soon as there's an imbalance between supply and demand, it creates an upward price in the stock or a downward price in the stock, and that happens instantly. If you were to look at exchange rates or stock markets, every 10 seconds the price changes. Like, it's constantly fluctuating. But that's not the case of an iPhone or any other product out there. Something happens which will create certain forces, and over time these forces will either lead to a price increase or decrease. So in this case here, if all of a sudden, due to the Sony release, there's this drop in demand for this iPhone product, so this was the demand for iPhones. Well, all of a sudden there's this drop. Well, you would expect over time something to happen on price, but in the very short run, we haven't moved to the new demand curve yet. So what we have here is at the current price of 1,000, we have this amount of quantity supplied, and we have this amount that are demanded. We used to have the same amount of people, same quantity of people that wanted to buy the iPhone than what was supplied, and a market clearing equilibrium, we would say, one that has no excess demand or supply. But because of this drop, due to a change in price of a competitor, change in taste, whatever it may be, has led to a drop in demand, which has led to a situation that price, half of the people that were wanting to buy it beforehand still want to buy it. The other half have disappeared. Therefore, we have an excess supply of product. We have a surplus. So in this case here, we have an excess supply, which is also known as a surplus. And if you're Apple and you realize that you produced a lot, you've made a lot of product, and not everything's being sold, your prices will adjust. You'll either lead to a price drop in the future, or something else will happen. It's not going to happen right away. They don't make these announcements every 10 seconds like the stock market, but it changes over time. So we can see that in this story, if I kind of go back to this 3-step framework, well, what can we notice? Well, we started from a situation and we have supply and demand of iPhones, and we have an equilibrium price. Apple has good market research. It determined what's the appropriate price to charge to maximize profits, and we'll see how that works later on when we talk about the different market structures. Then after that they established this and they announced the product in the next month or so, well, before people were able to go to the store and make the purchase, Sony or another competing brand released another product that is superior. In the technology world, things change fast. For cameras and phones and everything else, it's constantly changing. So all of a sudden, there's this new release, and it's dropped the demand for iPhones. What does a drop in demand for iPhones represent? Well, it represents that for any of the prices that could have been seen before, the quantity I choose to demand, the market demand, the combination of everyone here, maybe some of us still want to buy it because we just find it simple. I like it because it's linked to my computer. Everything's just seamless between Apple products. So I'm not sure I'd be ready to switch to Sony, but some other people might be more interested. So because of that, some people stop buying it, some people keep buying it, and over time, these market forces will lead to the demand curve shifting left. So here we have a shift in the demand curve, shifting left. And what do we expect to happen? The price and quantity. Well, if I draw it out, I started here at point A, I ended here at point C. In between the two, I've had a drop in demand, a drop in price, and a drop in quantity sold. So I've dropped the quantity sold a little bit, and the price has dropped as well. Less units are getting sold, and they're getting sold at a lower price, is what we expect to happen. Okay. The same logic goes with the supply curve. When we draw the demand or the supply curve, we say, what's the relationship between the price that I can sell the product and the quantity I wish to supply? There is a positive trend between the two. And for supply curve, it's for other reasons. But essentially, the more you pay me, the more it's easy for me to outsource work or do other things, work overtime. And the more you pay me, the more I'm willing to work for you, or the more I'm willing to supply product for you. That's the relationship that we see. But with the supply curve, once again, we're dealing with a two-dimensional representation of reality. In more advanced economics, we can use advanced mathematics to look into all of the spheres that can influence the quantity demanded at the same time. We could program an equation that takes not only into account the price of your own product, takes into account the price of competing products, taste, and a bunch of other things all at the same time. Well, in that case, if everything's taken into account, it's constantly changing. But in this case here, we're trying to abstract from everything else. We're saying this is what we observe, this is our relationship, and if one of those outside factors changes, we have to update our graph. That's essentially what we're saying. Okay? So in this principles of microeconomics, what we're aiming for is just finding a way to make this two-dimensional, simple to understand. But that means that every time something else changes, then the price of that own product, things shift. But a change in the price of Sony, does that shift the supply curve? So here's the, yeah?
Like Sony prices go down?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does it change the supply curve of Apple iPhones?
Maybe even more down. The demand would even go down.
Yeah, so the demand, I agree, goes down. So here's one of the biggest mistakes that happens in all of this analysis is trying to go too far ahead too fast. And what I mean by that is a situation that if you say, well, Apple released a product, $1,000. A few weeks later, Sony announces something that's quasi-identical for $500. You know that this kind of impact, this whole story is going to happen. So some people kind of seize all of this and they say, well, supply is going to drop. Okay? We'll have a situation where supply is going to drop. But the supply curve, if we kind of remove the rest of the story here and we kind of talk about price and quantity, and I talk about the supply of iPhones, if I'm Apple and I say for different prices I'm willing to supply different quantities of iPhones, and you tell me the price of Sony changes, it's not really going to change my supply curve. If you tell me that the materials needed to produce an iPhone go up in price, well, now for the same quantity as before, I'm going to charge a higher amount. I'll need to be paid a higher amount to compensate for that extra cost. If you tell me that the workers that I hire are now more expensive, same thing, for the same quantity as before, I'll need a higher price. If you tell me that I can have a new technology now that allows me to produce things more efficiently, cheaper, well, it tells me that for the same quantity, I won't need as high of a price because I could produce it more cheaply. All of those things, input costs and technology, will have an influence on the supply curve. And if we're talking about like farmland and apple orchards and everything else, well, obviously if there's a drought or there's forest fires, it's going to have an impact on the supply curve as well. But Sony having lower price product coming in does not shift the supply curve. It doesn't shift this relationship between Apple's price and quantity that they're willing to supply. What it does, though, is when you do the full analysis, you notice that due to this drop in price of Sony product, this drop in demand for Apple product, in the end, comparing A to C, or whatever letter is here, I notice that I have a smaller quantity exchange. So the quantity sold and at the end of it is lower, yes. But if you say that the supply curve shifts left at the same time and you have it shift left over here, you might say, oh, in the end, the price hasn't changed because supply curve shifted left. Well, why did the supply curve shift left? If you can't find a valid reason, it's probably because it hasn't. That's why I say when you're solving these news events, try to really think it through. Think about supply on its own, demand on its own, and ask yourself, is something that's going to have an influence on demand or supply here? So if we're thinking about changes in taste, changes in price of competing goods, changes in income, and we'll see soon, we'll talk about like people fearful that they might not have toilet paper, like toilet paper frenzy that we had during the beginning of the pandemic. Well, all of those things will have an influence on demand. But the supply curve are not influenced by that. Supply curve will be more, well, what happens if the raw materials that we were buying beforehand are no longer available because people weren't able to work because of social distancing, which led to a situation that now these raw materials aren't as available, and now these companies are all fighting to get the same material. It's costing more money, so for them to produce something, it's more expensive to produce. Their input costs have gone up. That's going to have an influence on the supply. That's going to have an influence on how much they're going to have to charge for a certain product at the end of the day. Okay? So it's really, to me, when I think about all of this, obviously there's kind of like key steps to help you out, but at the end of the day, it's just taking time to understand it and just kind of walk it through and think it through. And if you can do that, you're set for this chapter. Okay? All right. So, any questions on this? No? Okay. So, let's think about anything that's happened in this COVID kind of situation and try to understand what may have been the cause of it all from the start. So, and there's, at the end of the day, unless there's an impact that has an effect on two things at once, which can happen. In the notes, there is the example of like workers having a raise, so they might consume more, but at the same time, it means that the company that's hiring them has higher input costs. There might be dual effects, but otherwise, you'll always have 4 different possible outcomes, which is supply goes up or shifts right, supply goes down, so this is right, left, and then you could have demand goes up, right, or demand goes down, left. And what are the 4 different outcomes? So I'll draw these small, but you'll kind of get the point across. So if I see this, and this is my initial point, well, if supply goes right, what happens here? Well, I'll have the outcome will be price goes up and quantity goes up. If my supply goes left, I'll have a situation where, sorry about that, that's wrong. Supply, sorry about that, I'll restart. Trying to go too fast. Okay, let's start this from the start. Let's just put all supply and demand. Okay, let's change colors. So, supply shifts right. Supply shifts right, so I'm going to S2. What's happening here? Well, prices go down and quantity goes up. Here, if supply shifts left, I can notice that now my prices went up and my quantity went down. Or I could have demand shifts right. Demand shifts right. So I could see in this situation here that both my price and my quantity went up, or the man shifts left, which I have a situation where price and quantity dropped. That's only 4 possible outcomes, unless it's a combined outcome, and then you have to kind of look at both effects at the same time. But overall, you'll always see one of these 4 things happen. Unless for some reason the price barely changes or the quantity barely changes. But overall, it's going to be one of these. And if you could understand that these are all unique, these 4 outcomes are all unique, and that these shifts are all unique, then it's going to help you understand which one happened. So I'm kind of giving you guys the solution to questions I'm about to ask. So without looking at this here for a second, we'll come back to it. Think about this summer. This past summer, pieces of wood such as 2x4s, plywood, everything else that are kind of construction-based materials that are commonly used to build a house, between when I made some purchases in April and May and now, have doubled in price. Wood has doubled in price. So what could be the causes of this price increase? There's 2 different things that could cause a price increase in all of these. Okay, so let's just highlight both of them and then we'll kind of go back to it. Yeah?
Demand could go up a lot because more people are building houses. Also, there could be a scarcity of wood because not as many people are harvesting.
Perfect. So either the demand goes up because a lot of people are building houses, or it could be that supply is going down. For what reason that supply is going down?
Oh, there's supplies going down because not as many people are working. Not as many people are getting the wood itself.
So here I would say not as the supply could go down in this case here because the workers weren't able to work on the lumber yards and other things like that. Okay. Yeah.
I know like a lot of places like the wages went up when they were throughout COVID, so like their wages can go up, so that increases the demand or the price.
So if I think of wages going up, which of these would it influence? Would it influence the supply curve or the demand curve? The supply curve, very good. And when we were talking about the supply curve a second ago, if I want you to supply the same quantity, whatever it may be here, 10 units as before, will you now require a higher price than before or a lower price due to these higher price? So as soon as you establish that and you draw it out, you notice that the supply curve, we could say, went up or shifted left. Okay. Here's the confusing part of the supply curve, and I didn't want to jump into this too much, but I'll kind of say it here. The reason why I prefer to say right or left for supply and demand is right here, you could say that the supply curve shifted up, but the supply curve shifting up is a drop in supply. Because if I look at a given price, compared to before, here compared to this, here I have a smaller quantity supply. So here when I say an increase in the supply or a drop in supply, it's actually increasing or dropping based on an increase for a specific price. So in this case here, I don't like saying it goes up, because in this case here, I rather say supply curve shifted left, and I could say that there has been a drop in supply, a drop in quantity supplied at a given price, or any of the prices. So here, going from S1 to S2, I could say that there is a drop in quantity supplied, or a drop in the supply curve. Okay. So, in this case, and the pandemic, which one do you think is the main reason why the price of this wood went up? Was it because the supply curve shifted left for wage reasons, lumber yards being closed, or was it, boom, the demand curve went up because everyone wanted to build a new house all of a sudden? Yeah.
Demand curve went up.
Why?
Well, there's more time. People have more time on their hands because they're in quarantine, so home projects and things like that.
Yeah, so that's a distinction I wanted to make. I'd agree with you, and that was going to be my follow-up question. I agree with you if you're talking about wood that is used for like decking material. This summer, it was impossible to find treated wood for the longest time because everyone was making a really kick-ass deck because they couldn't go out anywhere to have a drink with friends or whatever. So everyone was trying to improve their home kind of setup. So in that case there, I agree that that's an increase in demand that normally these people wouldn't have changed their decks or built up their decks this summer, but because they had lower other options, the alternative options were less available, a lot of people started working on those do-it-yourself projects. I agree with you for that. Building your own home as a do-it-yourself project, I'm doing it, but I don't think everyone's ready to do it. So for that reason, for the actual like lumber for building a home, it's more based on the lumber yards that's caused this drive up in price. Yeah.
This would usually, like, maybe not for like doing yourself stuff, but when stuff like this happens,
Yeah.
is there usually like after do you see like a low like the demand like maybe after the pandemic or something, like less people might want to go out and build decks because they've already done it.
Mm-hmm.
Or they don't need to, like they're kind of doing it in the fall and now they do it in the summer, so they don't need to do it in the fall.
Yeah.
Will we see like the demand curve start to shift like over again?
Shift back and shift maybe lower a little bit.
Shift back, like even further back than it was before, and just like in a many cases, you usually see that after like something an event happened or something, and then it
Yeah.
starts to go back to kind of what it was before.
Yeah, you'd probably expect to see some of it for sure. It's the same kind of idea as if you're coming close to Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or Boxing Day or whatever. Sometimes some people might delay their purchases expecting a deal to come up. So they're going to buy less for a certain amount of time and then they'll buy afterwards. So there is these time shifts that happen. And if you were kind of waiting to build up your deck or you were a bit waiting to buy something else and now you bought it, well then in the future you won't need to rebuy it. So obviously there'll be a drop going on there. I'm not sure if everyone that wanted to build a deck built one. And then the other thing I was talking about, because I got like a lot of materials delivered over the summer, like for the longest time, like I came back from New Zealand early April and for like 2-3 months I lived at home and worked from home, and I went out of my place from like 4 or 5 days, that's all. Because I didn't have to leave because I would just call up my lumberyard and say I need this and they'd deliver it to me. So the most contact with humans I had other than my girlfriend was delivery guys. And those people, we had many chats with respect to wood, and I kind of asked them like what do they expect to happen, and they said, well, because these lumber yards shut down, we fell into a situation that a lot of people ran out of materials really fast, so they started driving up the price, and then they tried to get the products out quicker, so sometimes some of the quality has dropped and some of that stuff. And I was asking, like, do you think this will kind of last over time? Because what I decided to do for myself this year is I decided not to put the exterior siding yet, which will be wood, but I'm hoping that next year the prices kind of readjust and go back to normal. And the whole idea there is that he believes, some of the people that I spoke to believe that over the winter, typically things kind of slow down. The economy kind of slows down in the construction kind of area. So a lot of those companies will be able to start piling up wood again, and then we might start going back to some form of normal. But right now they've fallen so short so fast that it was just kind of like their solution to bring up the price. And then another person I spoke with, he had an interesting point on all of this, and I'm curious to analyze this in the future, and this is something we'll discuss in chapter 11, is he believes that some of the lumber yards kind of like form some kind of collusive cartel in this whole process and decided to jack up the prices so they can make more money because we have this scarcity going on. So did they really have to increase the prices so much? That might be something like we've seen in the past of a bunch of gas stations raising the price and all acting as a cartel, which is illegal. but it's still something that happens. Yeah.
Like the demand.
Yeah.
Is it possible it went up because of Bank of Canada? The rate of buying new houses went down.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so the rate of interest, not just on buying houses, but like for myself, my line of credit, the interest rate's really low right now, and it's because we're going through this kind of small recession, and in those periods, often through monetary policy, they drop interest rates to stimulate investment and consumption. And yes, so some of that consumption happens for that reason, but a lot of it happened when we speak of decking based on the idea that a lot of people had a lot of time on their hands, or they wanted to make their home environment as best as possible. Like a good friend of mine works in audio equipment like speakers and everything else, and he said this summer was absolutely crazy. Like the amount of sales that he got, the amount of phone calls, because everyone wanted to make their home studio music environment as best as possible because they were spending so much more time there, and a lot of people just had that extra income. So here we often talk about income as well as a factor. Well, if normally you spend like $10,000-$20,000 on a travel trip and this year it got canceled, well, you have all that extra money, and so sometimes you'll go and buy something else instead. Did you have a question? Yeah.
No, I was just going to add, I remember my parents were telling me about something. There's like a week-long power outage.
Yeah.
In the 90s kind of thing. In our area, there's two kind of main gas stations.
Yeah.
One's on the big road and one's in the small town.
Yeah.
And when that happened, the small town gas station kept the prices just the same as normal, but the one on the big road jacked the prices up. And they made a lot of money from that, but the outfall was after the power went back to normal, nobody went to the gas station that jacked the prices because it was like an not evil thing to do, but going like we have two options, that was it, and then they went out of business. So it's just a thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and when you're thinking about all that, even though you're dealing with higher costs, you always have to consider what the alternative options are to know how much you could push that cost on to the other people. And for me, I haven't re-verified with the company that sells wood exterior siding whether they've increased their price or not. And to me, I'm not sure they will. And the reason, can anyone think of the reason why I agree and I could clearly see a 2x4 or piece of plywood increase in price, but wood as an exterior siding might not increase in price? Why could that be the case? They're both wooden products. They've both had some form of scarcity in the summer. Why would one not change in price and the other one definitely change in price? What could be one of the reasons why? That's my perception. We'll see if it's true or not in the following months. Okay. So we have to keep in mind all the other factors that influence the demand curve, okay, and whether it's going to shift or not. So some of those factors to keep in mind from a business standpoint is if you're selling 2x4s or you're selling pieces of plywood, there's not many alternatives to a 2x4. Like you can kind of like use metal framing to build your interior walls in the house. You could use different things, but if you're gonna make a floor, like you need a base that is made of wood. Like there's nothing else available. So it's easy in those industries to say, well, there's a scarcity, we're just gonna start bringing up the prices. People will keep buying. What's the difference with exterior siding? There is substitutes. You could have vinyl wood siding. You can have brick siding. You can have rock siding. You could have many other sidings available. You could have steel siding. So some people sometimes use the steel that you would put on the top of the house and they put on the side. Very modern look. So different types of aluminum or whatever on the side of your house. There's alternatives. So if Maybach or another brand that sells wood siding decides to increase their price by 50%, but vinyl, metal, and everything else doesn't change in price, there's a good likelihood that they're going to lose a lot of customers. Because people will just say, well, normally I would have gone for this, but now this is relatively cheaper. And I'm just going to substitute my consumption. So as soon as you have many substitutes in your category and those aren't changing in price, it's going to make it very hard for you to change that. And we'll talk more about that with elasticity as well. Any other questions here? Okay. So we've gone through that whole process for wood. If we think about like paper, the toilet paper, what happened there? Like what was going on? Like I was in another country when it was going crazy and I was like, what the hell are those people doing back home? So I guess people were fearful that they'd run out of toilet paper, so they bought like 5 years worth of toilet paper, and it's just like, really? Anyways, but that's just a kind of a fear that led to a certain change in taste or a certain kind of desire not to run out. So there was just a massive increase in demand. That just massive increase in demand. If we kind of go back to that scenario, even if prices don't change, when you have a massive increase in demand with the prices not changing, what's going to happen is quickly you're going to have much more quantity demanded than quantity supplied. Therefore, you'll have a shortage. That's what happened. They ran out of toilet paper. They had to control and say, you could only buy this amount of toilet paper. You could only buy this amount of Purell. You know, so it's these different things that can happen. I would have never seen that one coming. There's other things you could clearly see coming. If you've seen things like this before and you've analyzed news events and you try to figure out which industries will get hurt the most, which ones will get hurt the least, you could start getting an idea, which is very useful for you if you work in finance or if you invest money, but also if you're a consumer. If you're a consumer and you say this year I'm going to build a house and you see this coming, you're going to buy those materials as quickly as possible because you know the prices are going to go up. Okay? So you always have to keep that in mind. What will prices do over this pandemic? What will prices do over this recession? And it's the thing, like a lot of people think that recessions always lead to a situation where everyone's losing. It's false. There's always industries that will gain from a recession. If we think of 2008 was a really big recession, well, companies such as Campbell's Soup did amazing because people wouldn't treat themselves going out to the restaurant as much, but like cheap ways to kind of fill yourself up and survive and like still have some nutrition did really well. Okay. And now if you think about like this kind of pandemic and like now some of the zones are going back in kind of like orange area that we're dealing with, so less people will be able to go out to the bar. Well, my girlfriend works at Ciboire and I know the owners well there, and that microbrewery, like this summer, they didn't do so well because they couldn't really be open for a large portion of the time, but like selling beer at home was amazing. Like they sold so much because people not being able to consume in the bar bought a lot at home. So if they didn't have that bottling facility, they would have done way worse. Any operation that didn't have the option of having takeout or a bottling facility did very poorly this summer. But anyone who had that option did pretty well, actually. Some are saying it's almost one of the better summers in the end for them. So you have to keep all of that in mind. So for anything that might happen, I'd say I'll give you a news event and you have to kind of analyze it through. And if you see something that's happened, if anyone else has any other kind of weird examples that they can think of what's happened this summer, try to see what's happened. It's one of these four things that have happened. If you say that price and quantity went up, well, it has to be an increase in demand. If you say that price went up but quantity went down, it has to be that supply has dropped. Okay, so as soon as you know that, it makes it easier to know what's the underlying cause.
I was just going to mention going like, because of the pandemic, a lot of businesses in like the e-learning industry have gotten like a major influx of interest and stuff.
Obviously. Yeah, big time. Yeah, like you work for the OLTC, right? And like I remember for like the summer, like we were on different meetings and the amount of like people who aid professors in e-learning was like those people that anyone who's trained in that this summer got a job. Like obviously, like there's just so much demand. So it's just different things to keep in mind for sure. Yeah. Anyone else have an example they want to share? Anything you've noticed? Anything that's kind of changed in price or quantity over the summer that you've noticed? Yeah.
Zoom.
Huh?
Zoom.
Zoom? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's what-
Like they've come up with all these different alternatives to make you purchase Zoom rather than just using it for free, and Zoom premium and things like that. I refuse to do it. I'm a friend.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, so everything that dealt with like technologies to communicate with people all around had a big impact. We're seeing a lot more people were working remotely and want to keep remotely even though they're allowed to go back to work. So that's having a big shift on all of these communication devices, maybe even just a comfy chair to work from home and whatever. Like there's a lot of things that might be happening there and how people purchase, how much people drive. A lot of people are driving a whole lot less than they're used to if they can work only 2 days from the office and the rest of the time from home. So a lot of shifts are going around in those industries as well. Had a comment in the back? Yeah. Hand sanitizer, yeah, so that's the big one, like with toilet paper, yeah, all of that's gone up in price and for sure. Yeah.
People were mass buying guns and ammo. That was one.
Yeah, that was a weird one I found, but yeah, a lot of people buying guns and ammo or toilet paper. When I see that happening, it kind of makes me sad a little bit to think that, I don't know, like, instead of people thinking collectively for everyone else and just thinking I'll just buy my fair share of toilet paper and Purell, I'll just buy as much as I can, screw the others, and I'll buy a gun as well so that if someone comes for my toilet paper, I'll be able to defend it. You know, it just makes it seem very individualistic, and I'd prefer a more collective society for sure. Yeah.
Uber, like people stopped taking public transport.
Yeah.
Uber put a premium during the virus.
Yeah.
Like in Montreal, like they're charging more.
Yeah. So different premiums were available there too. Yeah, and I understand some of the premiums. Like for us, like we're at limited capacity here between each classroom. Someone comes and clean. And the same thing if you go see the massage therapist. But then it's always the gamble whether you increase the price or not, because some clients will understand that they can't see as much and they have more work to do, and some others might go like after the fact, like that gas station example, like I'm not going to see this person because like he took advantage of this opportunity. So like anyone who increases the price might do well for some amount of time, but may run a risk in the future for sure. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Like at-home workout or exercise products.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Sell those all over Instagram.
Yeah.
Ads for this.
No, it's insane. Everything that relates to making everything at home as best as possible are big. Like bicycles sold out super fast. Stand-up paddleboards were the hardest to find for the longest time. All of those kind of things that makes your life less miserable when you can't travel or you can't do other things. So yeah, for sure. Cool. So at the end of the day, you need to understand well how the demand curve moves, how the supply curve moves. And if you could understand that when it's own price that moves, then we're moving along the demand curve or the supply curve. But when it's an external factor that changes, something that's not embedded in here, like any of these things or input costs or technology, then something's going to shift. And once that thing shifts, if you analyze it in the 3-step framework, you'll probably get a really good result. But if you try to go too fast and you say, well, this is going to lead to a drop in supply because quantity supply will eventually drop, but there's no reason why the supply curve shifts, you're going to have a wrong answer. Like I see it a lot of times, having someone say, well, because of this Sony release, there's going to be a drop in supply of iPhones, so I'm going to shift supply curve left, and in the end you say, oh, price is going to increase. It's like, why the hell would the price of iPhone increase because the Sony came out with a cheaper product? It doesn't make sense. So it's because you did something wrong. Okay? So kind of go through this whole analysis, make sure it makes sense, have it shift, and then just think it through. And if you can do all of that and it makes sense, you're golden for this chapter. Cool. We'll leave it to that today unless there's more examples, and otherwise I'll see you guys next week. Thanks.